Hello and welcome to a new Avastar video. Today we're diving into the binding and skinning section. This is where we connect our meshes to the Avastar armature. So let's jump right into it. Our main focus for this tutorial is the binding panel. This panel is located in the vertical Avastar tab. However, this panel only becomes visible if you've selected either an armature or a mesh. If you don't see it right away, don't worry, we'll get there soon. What we need in the scene is at least one mesh to bind and one armature to bind it to. Makes sense, right? For this demonstration, I've created these tiny, cute horns that we're going to bind to an armature in just a moment. So we already have the mesh ready, but there's no Avastar rig in the scene yet. When we select the mesh, the binding and skinning panel appears in the Avastar tab, but it currently displays a warning: no Avastar rig has been detected. Let's fix that by creating a default Avastar character. Once we have the Avastar model in the scene, let's select our mesh again. But wait, what's this? We can no longer select the mesh. Panic? Blender broken? Avastar bug? No, don't worry, here's the thing. Blender has a safeguard designed to prevent unintentional selection of other objects. Here's what's happening. The armature we just created is in pose mode, while the mesh is still in object mode. But because of Blender's guardrails, we're now forced to set the armature back into object mode first. Honestly, this isn't such a bad thing for most use cases, except when it comes to binding, of course. But there is a cure. You can open the Blender Edit menu in the top row, then untick the checkmark at the Lock Object Mode option. This will allow you to select the mesh while the armature remains in pose mode. But you know what? Since I'm all in for making things easier, I have added a shortcut, a tiny little icon right below the top menu bar. Just click on this icon to unlock or lock object mode in a snap. Now, back to the topic. Once we select the mesh again, we'll see a list of available rigs in the binding and skinning panel. In our case, there's only one, the one we just created. Selecting the armature here will finally reveal the binding options. And just to mention for completeness, this isn't the only way to get things done. You can also directly select the armature and the mesh right in the viewport if that feels more intuitive for you. Now let's talk about binding. The method you choose really depends on what you're binding. We've got the most common binding options available, and you can select them from this drop-down list. Copy from meshes. That's the one currently selected. Automatic from bones, and this is the one we'll be using. Create empty groups, perfect for the purists out there. And lastly, preserve weights, an absolute lifesaver when working with developer kits. Each method has its use case, so pick the one that works best for your workflow. For now, let's keep things simple. In this example, we're just binding the horns to the head bone, and our method of choice is automatic from bones. Oh, I can already hear the critics. This is too simple. You can do that in Blender in a snap, yada yada. But trust me, we'll make things more complicated soon enough. Now, we can give the tool some helpful hints if we already know which bones we want to bind the horns to. In this case, it's just the head bone, so it's pretty straightforward. But here's the catch. If we hit the Bind to Armature button without tweaking any additional settings, Blender will go ahead and try to create weight maps based on its automatic calculations, what it considers optimal. This happens because Blender analyzes the armature and mesh structure, but it doesn't understand our specific intentions. And here's the problem. In most cases, Blender's guesswork doesn't quite hit the mark. But don't worry, we can fix that, and I'll show you how. First, open the rigging panel. This is where you can control which bones are visible in the scene. For our purpose, we only need the torso bones. To make things clearer, temporarily disable the bone shapes and then select just the head bone from the torso group. Pretty intuitive, right? Now, you might be wondering why the head bone is part of the torso group instead of the head group. Trust me, there's a perfectly good reason for that, but that's a story for an entirely separate video. Next, head back to the binding panel and make sure both the mesh and the armature are selected. Now check the Only Selected Bones option. This tells the binding tool to focus exclusively on the head bone we selected earlier, And if you want to double check which bones are currently selected, simply make the armature the active object. Finally, once you've confirmed that all the settings are as intended, go ahead and hit Bind to Armature. And after just a split second, well, okay, sometimes it takes a bit longer for really large meshes. There you go, we're done. Now let's inspect the Vertex Groups panel of the mesh. This is where the weight maps are stored. If everything worked correctly, you should see only one weight map for the head bone. Looks good to me. Let's give it a quick test by animating the head bone. Perfect. It moves beautifully. That's exactly what we wanted. Oh, and a quick tip for the newbies in the audience. If you're not happy with the results, or you need to tweak your settings and try again, just hit Ctrl-Z on your keyboard. That's your magic undo button to time travel back into the past. Sometimes you might need to hit it a few times to get back to the moment where things started going wrong. From there, you can start fresh and try again. So, let's revisit the binding panel. Make sure you've selected only the horns. You'll notice that the binding and skinning section has changed a little. First, the bind option is greyed out. That's because your mesh is already bound, so there's no need to bind it again. Instead, you'll see the message, No Unbound Mesh Selected. Now we have access to the Unbind tool, which makes perfect sense for our current mesh. Sure, Blender provides a capable unbind tool on its own, but as always, I love to make things easier for the user. So our unbind tool speeds up your workflow just a bit, provided you know what you're doing. And a quick note to our longtime Avastar users, remember the freeze tool? You know, the one that let you convert the Avastar meshes into a custom mesh, join parts and all that fun stuff? Well, here's the deal. The bad news is that we've removed that tool. But the good news? We no longer need it, as you'll see in just a minute. So I made you curious? Great. Let's open up another demo file and take a closer look at what we have in the Unbind section. First, let's select one of the bound meshes and explore what this section has to offer. At the top, you'll see 3 options to choose from. Reuse. The tool will work directly on the selected meshes. Keep. The tool will keep the original meshes intact and work on copies. Hide, same as keep, but the original meshes will be hidden. The reuse option is the most intuitive and the one you'll probably use most often. It simply removes the mesh from the armature, similar to how the bind tool previously attached it. Now, there are 3 additional options for handling the unbind process. Apply shape keys. This automatically bakes the morph shapes of your mesh into the mesh itself. Apply modifiers. Applies all modifiers except the armature modifier. Unbind mesh applies the armature modifier and finalizes the unbind. When you select the unbind option, 4 more choices appear. Apply pose, bakes the current pose into the mesh. Remove weight groups, useful if you no longer need them. Cleanup, removes all Avastar related data from the mesh. Remove armature, this keeps only the mesh without anything else. And here's something cool, when you select 2 or more meshes, 2 additional options pop up. Join parts, glues multiple meshes together into one. Weld parts, make sure seams don't have duplicate vertices, which can cause bad shading. Yes, Blender does provide operators for most of what I've just explained, but I prefer to keep all those functions neatly in one place and let Avastar handle things for me, in the right way and in the correct order. For example, when you want to apply a pose to your mesh, you also need to make sure that the shape keys, if your mesh has any, are applied as well. Now, one last word about the freeze tool. As I mentioned earlier, we no longer need it. Here's how you can achieve the same result with the Unbind tool. Just select the meshes you want to freeze, enable all options in the Unbind panel and hit Unbind. Mischief accomplished. So what's next? Let's see. Yes, we have more binding methods available, and the one that's likely the most important in our context is the copy from meshes method. But hey, who doesn't enjoy keeping a little mystery for the next round? This video is starting to get a bit lengthy and repetitive anyway, so let's wrap things up for today. I'll prepare the next video to spark your curiosity even further. So, now go and enjoy your Avastar. Enrich the world with your amazing creations, have tons of fun, and of course, Have a wonderful day.